12:04. I think maybe we should get started.
Hi, my name is Michael Valoric. I'm the president of the Philadelphia chapter of the American Technion Society. I also serve on the national board and the executive committee of ATS. I would like to welcome you to our program. You may notice that this format is different than our other national webinars. Our event today is exclusively for supporters and friends of the Philadelphia area chapter, although we do have some out-of-state guests joining us. So I have to wish you a good morning, good afternoon, and a good evening. As you can see, we can all see and hear each other, and that is the point. We're coming together as a community, united in our admiration for the Technion. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. Please mute yourself during the presentation. You may submit questions, although the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen or after the presentation, you can unmute yourself to ask your question directly. Alyssa Gilson, Director of Development of our chapter, will moderate the question and answers to be sure everyone's questions are answered. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Technion Associate Professor Asya Rolls of the Technion's Rappaport Faculty of Medicine and the Prince Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases of the Brain. She is a professor of immunology and neuroscience who studies the physiological mechanisms through which emotions and thoughts affect physical health. She is also a proud Technion graduate who received both her bachelor's and master's degrees at the Technion. She has a PhD from the Weizmann Institute of Science and conducted postdoctoral work at Stanford University. Professor Rolls and her team have identified a neuron pathway that shows how positive expectations may have an effect on how the body fights disease, a very relevant and timely subject in these anxious times. I'd like to acknowledge our local donors who support the work of the Prince Center for Neurodegenerative Disorders of the Brain, helping to make Professor Rolls' research possible. Thank you to the Lasco Family Foundation, Anita Steen, the Charlotte Cohen Weinberg Foundation, and others who have contributed to this fascinating and critical work. And with that, I hand it over to Professor Rolls.
So, hello everyone. It's great seeing you. And I have to say that I'm enjoying much more this format, this Zoom format, when I can see you while we talk, and because it is frustrating not seeing who you're talking to and how they respond. So it's great that it's not a webinar option. And I recognize some of you, and it's great to see you again. And today, so I will tell you a little bit about some of the stuff that we are doing now in the lab. I decided that I will actually share with you some of the newest discoveries and the things that excite us the most these days, even though they are not published yet. But I think they're, you know how scientists are, they're always excited about the new thing they're working on. What was done was already not so exciting. So I will share with you our work. Just a second. We'll give you a brief presentation of that, and I will be more than happy to get your questions and answer some of them, those that I can. Okay, so basically, I think what we are doing, we're trying to tackle this mind-body question, which is a philosophical question, but I think what we're trying to do is to give, it reflects something that is fundamental, right? It's been there throughout history, and our medical development and our development as a culture, that the two things are connected. Our mind and our body are connected. Hippocrates was talking about that. Of course, the Eastern medicine did not go through this split, but I think the Cartesian view that kind of split the mind and the body, it made this disconnect very explicit. And then it followed up by these new discoveries, this ability that we now were able to identify the little bugs causing disease. And we kept on going down with all the development of microscopy. We started working deeper and deeper on cells and subsets of cells, and we kept dividing things. And we had pharmacology, so it was very exciting. Now you could dissect things. And I think we are in a time that we don't have to do it anymore. I think we gathered so much of this individual information, we dwell so much into the details, that I think that now we're in a time point that we can start asking that in a much broader way, to connect the dots and look on and kind of evaluate physiology as combination of both the mind and the body as a united system, but in a very precise and scientific manner. And that's what we are trying to do. So we know that there are psychosomatic experiences. We know it from very many different examples. We know that when we have a deadline, we can somehow postpone getting sick. We know that depression, stress and depression really are associated with increased risk of disease. There are many conditions that are induced by emotional states. For example, in irritable bowel disease and many inflammatory diseases of the gut, people can sometimes pinpoint the event, the emotional event that initiated the disease or this episode of the disease. So it's there, right? And of course, many pain syndromes are associated with connection for some sort of mental connection. I heard that in a recent survey, 40% of women who suffer from fibromyalgia report having a sexual harassment episode. So it's unbelievable, the connection. You can barely find these connections in any such a strong association. So things are there. And the question is how we approach it. And we approach it to some extent in clinic, right? We know that there's therapy, social support, and the clown therapy. And of course, in the clinics, we have this placebo effect, which people getting sugar pill and they just get better. So the evidence is there. And I have to remind you that pharmaceutical companies are really harmed by this placebo effect, right? Because they can invest $500 million in developing a drug, and in the end, a sugar pill can work not on everyone, but sometimes it works just as well. And it's a very big problem, but it has been recorded very effectively throughout the years, and it's there. The phenomena is there. And just to give you an example from the risk, we have also the other thing. We have a nocebo effect. A nocebo is when you anticipate that something wrong is going to happen, or a negative side effect. And we see it now with the COVID vaccinations. So what you see here is the side effects that people are experiencing when they are given. So this is the placebo, right? So people are experiencing same side effects even when they're just given a placebo vaccine. They're just anticipating many of these effects. And you can see that they're quite diverse. So our brain initiates this. It's their expectation, their negative expectation to experience that. So where is this connection? How do we combine? How we make something out of that in medicine? So our approach is that instead of making it a psychological or philosophical question and a mind-body question, we need to translate it into brain-body question, because thoughts and emotions, like positive expectation in placebo, eventually are associated with activation of certain brain areas. Like in positive expectations, the brain area that lights up is the reward system. It's a very ancient area in the brain. It's every time we expect something good to happen, we see firing in this area. So what we are asking is, how is that connected? We just want to ask whether when we see this brain activity, does it change somehow physiology? And especially, does it change the immune response? Because this is the body's main protection mechanism. This is the system that fights disease. So we did that. That was the work of my first PhD student, Tamar Ben-Shana, and now she is actually a postdoc at UCSF, and I hope soon coming back to be a professor in Israel. I know that many universities are already hunting her, so I'm very excited about that. And together with Shai Shanor, our next door neighbor, who does systems immunology. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to see whether by activating the brain's reward system, we can change somehow the immune activity. And we're doing this in mice, but we're doing the same stereotactic surgeries that you would do in humans. So we target a certain brain area, the reward system, and now we have a tool that we can activate it basically with a remote control. So we are activating the reward system of mice. We extract from them immune cells from their blood and culture these immune cells with bacteria. And we know that these immune cells are phagocytic, so they will just phagocyte the bacteria. So we see how many remaining bacteria are they. And you see here, every dot represents a bacteria that remained after the interaction with these immune cells. This is control, and this is after we activated the reward system of these mice. And you see that there are much less bacteria here, indicating that these immune cells were much more potent in killing this bacteria. So just by activating this brain area. Then we thought, so one of the things that, and of course this was a long story that we kind of were able to decipher how it happened, how it works, but then something interesting is there. We know that the immune system is there to fight bacteria and viruses, but this is also the main protection mechanism from self-damage, like what happens with cancer. And with cancer, the immune cells are supposed to kill the transformed cells. And we wanted to see if this will work. And this was, again, the work of Tamar Ben-Shana in the lab, together with a PhD, MD PhD student, Maya Schiller, and together with Dr. Fahed Hakim from, he's now the head of the Nazareth Medical Institute, and Miki Raad. So what we did now, we did exactly the same thing. We activated the reward system of mice that carried tumors. And what you see here is the size of the tumor. This is control, and this is after reward system activation. So you can see that just by activating the brain, the size of the tumor was reduced. There was no chemotherapy there, nothing. So how does it happen? How by manipulating the brain, we see such a huge change eventually in the tumors that are in the periphery? What we found was that it is mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. It's a system of neurons that exits the brain from the spinal cord, goes through the spinal cord, and actually reaches all immune organs. And the most interesting one that it reaches is the bone marrow. Why the bone marrow is so interesting? Because in the bone marrow, throughout life, we have the generation of new immune cells. So just think about that. The brain educates the new immune cells that are going to be formed. So it kind of adapts the nature of the immune system that it's going to be formed there. And what we found was that actually this change in the innervation to the bone marrow altered some subtype of immune cells that are immune cells. So they're supposed to fight the tumors, but tumors, because they're very tricky, actually make them as Trojan horse. So they actually work with the tumor and form a better environment for the tumor, and they suppress the anti-tumor immune response. But once the signal was coming from the brain, the tumor was not so effective in hijacking these cells. So it's a very interesting story that was going on there. And then we were quite fascinated by that, right? We say, okay, so it's really interesting. The brain seems to control the immune system with quite high precision. But if you control something, you need to know what's happening there, right? So if we take our air conditioning, it can control the temperature, but it needs to record the temperature in the room so it can adjust it, right? So somehow the brain should also record the state of the immune system in order to control it. So we started looking for that, and this is the new things that we are doing in the lab. And it takes us back actually to Pavlov. People who work with Pavlov, discovered that you can condition the immune system exactly as you can do any other forms of conditioning. What Pablo was doing, he was giving these dogs food and ringing the bell, so that after a while they associated the two, and now it was sufficient to ring the bell, and the dog's physiology, their gut, responded as if they were seeing food. So these people who were Metnikov and Koren, Metalnikov and Koren, they actually thought, they discovered that they can do the same thing for the immune system. I will show you in a second. The thing is that with history, like when politics gets into history, their discoveries were stuck within Russia and never got out. And this phenomena was rediscovered in the US by Eder and Cohen. And then it was followed up by Manfred Chedovsky, mainly from Germany. So here's the phenomena. We can give rats, mice, and humans a certain drug, say an immunosuppressive drug, and it could be done with many drugs, together with a different stimuli like saccharin. So we present them several times together, and after a while, it is sufficient that I give them saccharin, and the rats will respond with immune suppression. So what does it mean? That the brain somehow formed a memory trace, the same way it forms every other memory, associating the immune response, the immune suppression, with the saccharin. So where is it happening in the brain? And Tamar Koren in the lab, she's also an MD PhD student, and actually she's a very interesting student because she's a protege in violin. So before she became a medical student, she has like all these awards as a very talented violin player. So she wanted to see where it happens in the brain, this manipulation. And we focused on an area called the insular cortex. It's a very interesting area. It's a hidden area. It's an area that kind of represents the state of the body. It gets input from all organs and also kind of emotional inputs. And this is where you form this feeling, how do I feel? Self-feeling. And what we found is that in this area, when we have inflammation, there is elevated activity. But now we have tools that not only that we can find this activity, what you see here is neurons in label. And this labeling that you see here, it's a fluorescent report, it's a fluorescent marker that is expressed there. But it's also a certain marker that it's also expressing a protein that allows us to control the activity of these neurons. So what Tamar did, she captured these neurons that were active during the peak of an inflammation, a gut inflammation. And then once the mice completely recovered, she just reactivated these neurons. You can see that here, there are more neurons labeled in this area compared to in control mice. So she activated the same neurons. It's an amazing new technology that was developed in the very recent years. And what she got, this is the colon of a normal mouse. And what you see in red are immune cells. But have a look what happens to the colon of mice after we reactivated the same area in the brain, the same neurons. There are many more immune cells infiltrating there, causing this inflammation. So what it shows basically is that the brain can actively initiate disease, like inflammatory bowel disease. And now we're trying to decipher exactly how it happens. So where are we going with that? This is just an example of examples of the kind of how things that happen in our brain, areas that are related to stress, areas that are related, for example, to positive thinking, areas that are like serotonin. What happens when these areas are activated, and whether our brain forms some sort of representation of the immune system that it can then activate and can explain many different psychosomatic disorders. But what we are trying to understand is how it happens. Because if we understand the biology behind it, we can control it. We can develop new treatments to manipulate it. So for example, we can target different brain areas. One of the things that we're doing now is creating this map of the different brain areas and what they can do to the immune system. And if now we identify an area, and we actually are doing this in clinical studies with Professor Talma Handler in Ichilov, so we are manipulating these specific brain areas and training people to manipulate them so they can control the disease. And we can do it with focused ultrasound. We can do it with magnetic, it's called a TMS. It's a magnetic shield that you could put on the brain helmet. And then you'd create a magnetic field that is very targeted to a certain area that you want to control in the brain. And of course, if we can train people on their own using fMRI guided neurofeedback. So a person stays in the fMRI and we get real-time feedback of its brain activity. And then we train people to manipulate it. And she was doing these studies in fear-related phobias and in different traumas. But here we can, that's what we hope to do, is to teach people to control their own disease. And as you can imagine, it's a huge body of work that I'm only talking about, but the people who are doing that, they are the students in the lab and the postdocs. And especially I want to thank our lab manager, Dr. Hila Zulay-Debi, and Nadia Bushnak, who assists with all these experiments. I mentioned along the way some of the people in the project that we're involved in. And of course, our collaborator, Dr. Faid Hakim. And I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank the funding, and I want to thank the Prince Center for their support of this. And I'm happy to answer your questions and to hear your thoughts, and especially to wish you to stay well.
Thank you, Professor Rose, for the fascinating presentation. And now I'm going to turn things over to Alyssa, who will help moderate our questions and answers.
Yes, everyone, please feel free to use the chat feature, or since we can all see each other, raise your hand, give some sort of indicator if you have a question. I actually have a question just to get things started. Based on your presentation, the experiment, Professor Rolls, with the saccharin and the immunosuppressing drug, is that something that we could use as a concept to help reduce people's reliance on drugs that they have to take long-term that may have some undesirable side effects?
Oh, absolutely. It's actually being done. So there are some clinical trials now that, for example, for people who have chronic disease and they need to get transplants and some sorts. So one of the things that they're trying to do is to make this association, exactly this association, so that people, so that you can reduce the dose of the drug. What is the problem there? The problem there is that you need to find something that will be extremely, very different, like the association cue. So they're trying to create this drink that is going to be in purple and give it in a certain environment, because you need to generate this association. It's not simple. And the other thing is how many times you can cheat. Right? You cannot cheat too often. So you can only cheat the body several times. So what you do, you give it the drug, you associate it several times. You give now only the association cue, but you need to reinforce it after a while. So there are many challenges to work out there, but it seems like a very interesting direction that we are going, that can be actually used in clinic. Yes.
So interesting. Does anyone else have a question? I have another one then. My question has to do with prayer. And I'm wondering if people who pray, do their brains light up in this way? And people who believe that other people are praying for them, does that actually give them that same, physical positive response in their brains that could potentially actually help them physically?
It's a very good point. Actually, prayer is one of the things that are most related to activation of the brain's reward system. And the brain's reward system can be activated in many different ways. And And there are even studies showing that this connection, right? That people who pray somehow or have a strong belief, they actually recover better. And one of the explanation, when you follow that, you see that these areas are indeed more activated during prayer, during this sense of belief. By the way, the other thing is also addiction. Like any form of positive expectation is also going to activate the same brain area. So I think there are many different ways for people to activate this brain region, and it's very different to each individual. But prayer and belief is probably one of the strongest and unified ones. So yeah, I think it will activate this.
Thank you. It looks like our CEO, Michael, has a question.
I just have a question as a participant. So I have two questions. One following up actually on what Alyssa said. So your research must be a great boon for positive thinking self-help books and for, I mean, but on a serious note, meditation, Indian medicine, any of those areas. I mean, in a way, your research says today, based on scientific 21st century, we actually believe what some people have said for hundreds and thousands of years, right? You can influence your body. So I'm curious, you know, whether you get royalties from the meditation books. And so that's one area. The second is I woke up this morning listening to the news, and one of the first reports was about the collective trauma and stress in America has never been higher than at this point, based on the American Psychological Association, based on a year of COVID. And so a lot of your research would say, gosh, we're going to have a huge amount of illness to some extent, a wave coming, not only because people didn't go to a doctor for a year, but just in terms of what you were saying, we're driving ourselves nuts in our brains, and we're going to get sick because of that. So here are my two questions.
Yeah, it's a good point. First, royalties, I would love to get, but nothing yet. I can say that I'm a bit careful with the association there, because I really have to be careful with overinterpretation of what we are doing. Eventually, we are working only with mice, and we are trying to prove the connections, but there is a long way to go up there. And I even want to emphasize that I'm very careful with positive thinking, because when I was in my PhD, I had two advisors, Michal Schwartz and Ofer Lieder. And Ofer, he was an amazing person. He was sick for 24 years with leukemia. And I remember even back then, he was talking to me. He died in the middle of my PhD. And he kept saying that they sent people for him to consult because he's so positive and he's living for so long. And he said it's the most frustrating thing they can do, because not only that you are sick, now you feel I'm not thinking positively enough, and now I'm also responsible for my disease. So it's a horrible thing that we are doing to people when you are saying, oh, think positive, because it's very hard to think positive. It's not a trivial thing to say. So I'm trying to be very careful with what does it mean, and that's why I'm emphasizing. I entered the fMRI and tried to activate my reward system. It's not so simple. It's really, really not simple. And the worst thing is to sustain it. So I think we need to find the things that just feel right. And I think this is the connection also to the insula. But it's very important that then we don't make people think that they're also, that you're not thinking positively strong enough, because you don't know what you're doing. And so this is the other thing about stress and what's the real implications, I think, of this pandemic is we're going to pay a huge price for that. Not because we don't go to the doctors. Actually, I think it's a good thing, because you know that during the cardiology, when there's a week of cardiology meeting, the death from heart disease is the lowest. So, and it's the cardiologist here told me. So I think there is and there was the big kind of, how is it called, shvita, when you don't go.
Strike.
Right. So when there was this big strike of doctors, this was the lowest deaths in Israel. period of death. So I'm not sure it's the worst thing. Not that I'm not advocating not to go to the doctors, but this is not, I think, the real problem. I think the implications of stress and we are going to pay a huge price for that in the long term. And the social isolation, especially for the kids. I think this, we see here in Israel, a huge mental health spike in the teenagers. And I'm not so worried. And of course, there are going to be many social socioeconomical discrepancies that are only going to expand. And we know that these kind of stressors are critical. So I think the chronic stress is the worst thing. I really think that we don't even see the full implications of that yet, because, and also the fact, but the other thing is that we are all in it together. And I think this is in a way is a better thing, because there's something very difficult in being the only one who is in trouble. But there's something about this collectiveness that I think is giving, and we know that social interactions, they're actually activating the same areas, these positive areas. So at least if there is a good thing about it, is that we are all in it together. So it's a long answer to a complicated question.
I think we have a question from Adina Lambert. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I am actually a retired psychologist, and I was always very much interested in this mind-body connection. And just during my reading and my general knowledge, it came to my attention that something like 84% of all visits to a primary care doctor had some emotional component. And I thought that that was truly staggering, you know, people, but however, during my years, many years of practice, I experienced something where many people didn't want to hear that. They wanted me or the medical profession or somebody to give them the quick fix, and make it all better and make it all go away. And when you tried to explain to people that they needed to do the emotional work necessary, the mental work necessary, whether it was an emotional catharsis, it was healing the pain from their childhood or from some other experience, they really resisted it. So I kind of clung to this idea that 84% of all visits to a primary care physician have an emotional component. It was really very clear to me. I'm going to cut to the chase, though, because I have another question about the placebo effect. I have a situation right now. I got my first dose of the Pfizer vaccine, and I had a very positive attitude. I couldn't wait to get it. I'm expecting to get my second one. My daughter, my adult daughter, has an autoimmune disease. She was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis 10 years ago. She is doing very, very well, remarkably well. She takes prednisone every other day. So just yesterday, she was arguing with me that she doesn't want the vaccine. And I'm really concerned that she's going to have this negative attitude towards the vaccine, and she will develop some reaction to it. And my question, I guess, is how do I convince her to have a positive reaction or a positive attitude towards it? In addition to which, I have to add that her myasthenia doctor, her specialist, who truly saved her life 10 years ago, told her she has to get the vaccine. So of course I was very happy to hear him tell her that, because I was worried that she was going to avoid getting it altogether. And he made it very clear to her that not getting the vaccine and coming down with COVID-19 would be much, much more detrimental to her health. So the bottom line question is, can you give me any pointers for how we can keep her having a positive attitude towards this injection and not begin to have her mind think, oh, I had the shot yesterday, you know, I can't walk, or now I'm having trouble breathing, or whatever her symptoms might develop. So I'll stop, but thank you so much. It's a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. So I think the critical point is indeed that the doctor kind of, he supports that she takes it. And I think, well, I have a lot of discussions of that. The thing is that if there wasn't a pandemic, anyone would not inject the vaccine to itself, right? It's not like it's a neutral compound. The thing is that indeed the chances of getting COVID these days are not low, and the implications of the COVID are terrible. And I have to say that I don't think we even understand the implications, even for people who go very mildly on that. I think we're going to see many new waves. So I think in essence, and everyone is different in his personality, is just understanding that eventually what this vaccine does, it recapitulates part of what the virus will do. And actually all viruses do the same thing, right? They inject, so our body is full with DNA or information or RNA that we got from viruses, because we are exposed to viruses all the time. And I think in this sense, that's why the virus is relatively, and there are millions in Israel, all over the world, and definitely in Israel, that got the vaccine. And I don't think there are very critical side effects, because in the end, it just does what any other virus would do without the potential damage. So yes, the immune response is something that we need to think about. Of course, it's not a trivial thing, but it's inflammation. So of course, what I'm saying is that it's a risk evaluation, and the risk here, what sits on the balance, it's much more. But eventually everyone is different, right? I will be convinced by this very kind of, I have to say, what I think the main reason that people don't take the vaccine is because it's you doing something to yourself instead of leaving it to kind of chance or destiny if COVID will meet you or not. Only this week I went to two funerals, so I'm very clear about the chances here. So for me, it's very clear what's on stake, and yeah, I don't think I can give you a real advice.
Thank you. I do have one other question. I had heard something about, I think it's a little bit about what you're touching on, is a tumor surveillance, or the immunological response of tumor surveillance. And I know my husband actually was a cancer researcher with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Rich Prain. I don't know whether that name has ever come up, but he was one of the pioneers, and this was back in the 80s and the 90s, I think, doing tumor surveillance, where he really was putting out the idea that the body was always doing surveillance and killing cancer cells, tumors and cancer cells, before they ever could present themselves. Is there some connection to what you're working on, and how does that fit in?
Absolutely, there is a very tight connection. It's exactly that, right? In fact, we have a whole system of our immune system, the whole subset of cells, that what they will do is they just go around the body, they physically touch different cells of the body, test them to see if they present any deformed proteins. So when a cell becomes becomes a tumor cell, it will start generating different proteins that it shouldn't generate them normally. So these cells, they just surveil them and they kill every cell that will present anything that is wrong. The body has this strategy of saying, if it's not, we don't take any chances. So that's how, and there are some studies showing that every day we have a lot of cells that are undergoing this tumor kind of changes in different cells. But because of this system, they will just kill them. And what we saw is actually one of the mechanisms that these cells that are being manipulated by the nervous system, one of the mechanisms that they work by is they change the levels of an enzyme in which these other cells will kill the tumors. So it's actually, there is a direct connection there of this interaction between the the killer cell and the regulatory cell that is being controlled by by the nervous system. So yeah, absolutely that.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to have my husband watch this video later today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think we have a question from our friend Mark Greenberg.
Hi everyone. So Asya, it's fascinating, and you're drawing the kind of the answer to the placebo effect, that there's a physiological something going on. What's and if I missed this, I'm sorry, but so what do we do with that information? What's the next step in terms of implementing something?
So one of the things that can happen with that is, for example, you can predict if a drug is going to have a placebo effect before you go into clinical trials. Because if you give the drug and activate this brain area and you get an additive effect, then it's good. Then it means it should work in addition. But if you give this drug and activate this area and there is no additive effect, so it means that most likely this treatment is going to suffer from a strong placebo effect, which can be really critical for the pharmaceutical companies in terms of in what they invest. But the other thing is, I think, is harnessing this potential in the placebo, right? Like, if it's so effective, it's one of the most effective drugs, actually. 30% of placebo response. So many drugs we will kill to have such a strong effect. So I think the idea there is to uncover what the body will naturally do. What is, like, what we are doing now is we're trying to identify which pathway the brain will activate, what is changing there. And one of the things that we see, and actually I didn't realize that, but I was in a conference. It was a very international, multidisciplinary conference. And there was a guy, he was the head of the Salk Institute. And then he came to me in the end of the talk, and he comes from a very different field. And then he said, you see very weird immune responses, right? And I say, yes. He says, because you're activating the immune system in a very different way, in ways that we just don't usually activate in our experiments. So you can uncover pathways that we don't usually see. So I think this is the true potential of our work, is that by identifying what the different pathways that the brain will use, and then to boost them. So maybe in the end, it will translate into new drugs that will be related to that, or alternatively to different treatments. For example, when we started this work, I never thought that we should go to the bone marrow and manipulate the innervation to the bone marrow. Who could have, like, it's not something that you can predict. But then once you see it, okay, so now we can think of different treatments to the bone marrow, or even target these cells, something that we didn't think before. So I think it's both ways. It's both talking to the placebo itself and trying to reduce how bad it is for the pharmaceutical industry. And the other one is harnessing the endogenous potential there.
Thank you. Any other questions? I just want to say anecdotally to piggyback on Mark's question, I spent some time a few years ago with your former colleague, Professor Rolls, Itamar Khan, who told me of a study that on the placebo effect, where people were told that they were taking a placebo and it still had a positive effect. It was like the physical act of taking the pill and drinking some water activated whatever it needed to activate, even though they knew that it was a placebo. So I thought that was so fascinating. That stayed with me all these years.
It's true. And I think a big part of it is how much trust you have in your clinician. It's if the doctor told you, yes, it's a placebo, but we know it can work on some people, then, and you trust the doctor, this is a critical factor.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I will turn it back over to Michael Valoric, who has some parting words.
So thank you, Alyssa. I'd like to thank Professor Rolls for joining us today during her evening and taking her evening tonight in Israel. I'm sure you all agree that her work is incredibly interesting and relatable to all of us. And I thank you for joining us. It's wonderful to see many familiar faces and also new ones. I hope that you'll join us for future programs, virtual for now, and eventually and hopefully in person soon. In the meantime, stay safe, healthy, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day or night.
Thank you very much and have
Thank
a
you,
good
Asya.
day.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Great to see you all.
There. Thank you.